The clock on the wall didn't make a sound, but the time screamed at him, 11:30 p.m. Woojin sat in the center of the suffocating darkness, a silhouette of dangerously controlled intensity. 60 floors below, the city he ruled buzzed with a life he had long ago traded for power. Taxis crawled like glowing insects, and thousands of people slept soundly, unaware that the man who held their world in his palm was currently losing his mind over a missing housekeeper. A cigarette hung from his lips, the smoke curling upward like a dark secret. Woojin's black button-up was open, revealing the silver pendant resting against a chest covered in ink, tattoos that served as armor for a heart that had been broken long before he became a king. His eyes, heavy with the strain of 3 sleepless nights, were fixed on the door with the focus of a predator. He checked his metal watch again. 20 minutes late. In the underworld, Woojin was a man who could kill without hesitation. Men trembled when his name was whispered in the back rooms of New York. But as the minutes ticked by, the most dangerous man on the East Coast wasn't thinking about territory. He was thinking about Mabel, and for the first time in his life, the silence was a weight he couldn't lift. Before we find out what happens when that door finally opens, if you love high-stakes stories like this, please subscribe and hit the like button. It helps us bring more of these cinematic tales to life. Finally, the heavy oak door groaned on its hinges, cutting through the silence of the penthouse like a blade. Mabel stepped inside, her silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. She looked exhausted, her long, neutral-colored coat still buttoned tight against the New York chill, her eyes fixed downward on the glowing screen of her phone. She didn't look up, didn't sense the predator in the room, until the orange cherry of Woojin's cigarette flared in the dark. "You're late," his voice rasped, thick with a cocktail of sleep deprivation and repressed fury. Mabel jumped, her phone nearly slipping from her fingers as she turned toward the couch. The city glow hit Woojin's face, illuminating the sharp, tattooed angles of his jaw and the cold, reddish strain in his eyes. He didn't move. He sat with his arms resting on his knees, a statue of obsessive intensity. "I didn't realize I had a curfew, Mr. Kang," she replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the racing of her heart. She didn't apologize. Instead, she began to unbutton her coat with slow, deliberate movements, maintaining an emotional distance that drove him deeper into his own head. Woojin stood up, the smoke from his cigarette swirling around him like a storm cloud. He closed the distance between them in 3 predatory strides, stopping only when he was close enough to smell the faint scent of rain and old library books on her skin. "In this house, my time is your time. You've been gone every Wednesday for a month. Where were you?" "Out," she said simply, meeting his intense gaze with a neutral expression that refused to flicker. "I completed my tasks before I left. The house is clean. Your dinner was prepared. My personal time is my own." Woojin's jaw tightened, his pulse hammering against the black ink on his neck. To the world, he was a man who could kill without hesitation. But here, standing before a woman who refused to tremble, he felt a terrifying loss of control. He wanted to reach out, to grab her phone, to demand the names of everyone she had spoken to, but the textbook shield she carried, even if he couldn't see it yet, was already forming a barrier he couldn't breach. "Don't lie to me, Mabel," he whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. "New York is a small city for someone like me. If I find out you're seeing someone else—" "Then what?" she interrupted, her eyes flashing with a spark of defiance. "You'll fire me? Or is this the part where you remind me how much I owe you?" She walked past him toward her quarters, her coat draped over her arm, leaving him standing alone in the blue-tinted shadows. She was unaware of the war she had started inside him, a war between the man who wanted to possess her and the man who was terrified of losing her. Woojin watched her go, his knuckles white as he gripped his metal watch, the silence of the penthouse returning, heavier and more suffocating than before. Before Mabel was the shadow in Woojin's penthouse, she was a ghost in the streets of Chicago. The memory of that winter hit her harder than the New York wind as she closed her bedroom door, leaning her back against the wood to catch her breath. She closed her eyes, and suddenly she wasn't in a $15 million skyscraper. She was back in a sterile hospital hallway, the fluorescent lights flickering like a dying pulse. The decline had been a slow, agonizing theft. Her mother, Gloria, had been her entire world, a woman who worked 3 jobs to keep Mabel in private school, dreaming of the day her daughter would walk across a stage with a degree in her hand. But cancer didn't care about dreams. It took Gloria's health first, then her savings, and finally the roof over their heads. Mabel had watched her mother wither away, spending her final months in a state-run facility while Mabel worked double shifts at a diner just to buy the good pain medication the insurance wouldn't cover. When the end finally came, Mabel was left with a cardboard box of old photos and a bank balance that made her stomach turn. $47 total. The debt collectors didn't mourn. They circled like vultures, claiming the furniture, the car, and the small apartment in Hyde Park. Mabel had spent 3 nights sleeping in a 24-hour laundromat, her textbooks tucked under her head like a pillow, refusing to let go of the one thing her mother had died for, her education. She had been a star student at the University of Chicago, only 1 year away from a degree in international relations. But the world didn't need a scholar. It needed a body to scrub floors. The lifeline had appeared in the form of a discreet, high-end domestic agency. They were looking for someone invisible, educated, and desperate. When the agent mentioned the salary and the live-in arrangements for a private client in New York, Mabel didn't ask about his reputation. She didn't care that Woojin Kang was a name whispered with terror in the dark. To her, he wasn't a mafia boss. He was a paycheck that could buy her a way back to the life she had lost. She had arrived in Manhattan with 1 suitcase and a heart turned to stone. For 2 years, she had played the role of the silent maid, scrubbing the bloodstains off his expensive floors and ignoring the screams that sometimes echoed from the basement. She had learned to look through him, to treat him like the furniture, all while funneling every cent into a secret account to pay off the medical debt and fund her midnight classes. She opened her eyes and looked at the phone in her hand. A notification from the university registrar blinked back at her. Final exams approaching. She wasn't just a maid coming home late. She was a woman building a bridge out of a grave. And no matter how much Woojin prowled in the dark, she wouldn't let him burn it down. The tension between them didn't dissipate over the following days. It thickened, turning the air in the penthouse into a pressurized chamber. Woojin moved through the rooms like a restless ghost, his presence marked by the scent of expensive tobacco and the silent, vibrating threat of his obsession. He found himself finding excuses to be in whatever room Mabel was cleaning, his eyes tracing the line of her neck or the steady focus in her eyes. He was a man who understood power through visibility. His intricate tattoos were a map of his violence, a warning to the world that he had survived every attempt to break him. To Woojin, skin was a canvas for history, and his history was written in blood and black ink. But Mabel was different. Her armor wasn't etched into her skin, it was hidden in the stacks of paper she tucked under her arm and the heavy, dog-eared volumes she kept concealed beneath her bed. To her, the textbooks were more than just paper and ink. They were a mental fortress. Every time Woojin's gaze felt too heavy or his questions too invasive, she would mentally recite the theories of international law or the nuances of diplomatic history. It was a world he couldn't touch, a sovereign territory where he had no authority. Late on a Tuesday night, the two worlds finally collided. Woojin had spent the evening in a brutal meeting with the heads of the 5 boroughs, his knuckles bruised and his patience shredded. When he returned, the penthouse was quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioning. He walked past Mabel's partially open door and stopped. She was asleep at her small desk, her head resting on an open book, a highlighter still gripped in her hand. He stepped inside, his movements fluid and silent. He reached out, his tattooed hand hovering inches from her shoulder, but his eyes fell to the book instead. Contemporary Political Theory. His brow furrowed. He looked at the frantic, brilliant notes she had scribbled in the margins, the complex diagrams of power structures that rivaled his own syndicate's organization. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of something that wasn't jealousy, it was awe. He had spent years thinking of her as a desperate girl he had rescued from the streets, a quiet fixture in his home. But as he looked at the heavy shield of her education, he realized she wasn't hiding from him because she was guilty. She was hiding because she was building a life that didn't include him. He pulled back, his hand dropping to his side. The scars on his chest ached with a sudden phantom cold. He realized then that all the money and violence in the world couldn't buy him entry into her mind. She wasn't just his maid, she was a woman with a secret world, and for the first time in his life, the most dangerous man in New York felt completely outmatched. The silence of the penthouse was rarely peaceful. For Woojin, it was a minefield of memories. After retreating from Mabel's room, he found himself standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghosting over the twinkling lights of the city. He reached up, his fingers tracing the jagged silver line of a scar that his elaborate tattoos couldn't quite hide, a mark that sat directly over his heart. This was the work of Yuna. Years ago, before he was the feared head of the Kang syndicate, he had been a man capable of smiling. Yuna had been the daughter of a rival family, a peace offering that he had mistakenly believed was a gift of fate. He had loved her with a raw, unshielded vulnerability that he now viewed as a death wish. On their wedding night, amidst the scent of expensive lilies and the taste of vintage champagne, she had leaned in for a kiss and slid a ceramic blade between his ribs. She hadn't been a bride. She had been an assassin, sent by her father to decapitate the Kang leadership at its weakest moment, the moment of its leader's greatest joy. As he had collapsed onto the white silk sheets, watching the woman he worshipped wipe his blood from her hands with a cold, robotic indifference, something inside Woojin had died far more permanently than his flesh. He had survived the wound, rising from that bed of betrayal to dismantle Yuna's entire bloodline with a surgical cruelty that earned him his throne. But the cost was his soul. Since that night, trust was a foreign language he refused to speak. Every person in his life was a potential blade. Every smile was a mask for a motive. He had built his empire on the foundation of clinical suspicion, believing that if he never let anyone close, he could never be gutted again. He had treated Mabel as a servant because the alternative, treating her as a human being, was terrifying. He looked back toward the hallway leading to her room. The sight of her textbooks had triggered a phantom pain in his chest. Yuna had used his emotions to get close. Mabel was using her intellect to stay far away. Both represented a lack of control that made his blood run cold. He took a final drag of his cigarette, the smoke obscuring the city skyline. He had spent years convinced that his scars were his armor, but as he thought of Mabel's quiet, studious defiance, he realized his armor had become a cage. He was a king in a fortress, yet he was the only one trapped in the dark. While Woojin wrestled with the ghosts of his past, a living threat moved through the shadows of the penthouse with practiced ease. Dorian, Woojin's second-in-command, was a man built of cold ambition and sharp edges. He had stood by Woojin's side during the bloody ascent to power, but he had watched with growing resentment as his boss became obsessed with a mere housekeeper. To Dorian, Mabel wasn't just a distraction, she was a vulnerability that threatened the stability of the syndicate. More importantly, she was a convenient scapegoat for Dorian's own secret dealings with the rival families in Jersey. Dorian knew that logic would never turn Woojin against Mabel, but trauma would. He understood that the scar over Woojin's heart was an open wound that never truly healed, and he knew exactly how to salt it. Waiting until the penthouse fell into a deep, early morning hush, Dorian slipped into the kitchen where Mabel kept her personal belongings. With gloved hands, he pulled a burner phone from his pocket, a cheap, untraceable device he had preloaded with encrypted messages to a known hitman from the Una bloodline's remnants. He tucked the phone deep into the lining of Mabel's work bag, hiding it behind a stack of her university flyers. Then he moved to the home office, logging into the secure server under a ghost protocol. He began dragging files, ledger entries of offshore accounts and shipment schedules, into a hidden folder labeled with Mabel's initials. He made sure the digital breadcrumbs were just messy enough to look like the work of an amateur spy, someone close to the heart of the operation who was selling secrets for a way out. The final touch was a series of fabricated bank transfers. He funneled small, consistent amounts of syndicate money into a dormant account he had opened in Mabel's name months ago. To anyone looking, it appeared that Mabel was being paid for her services every Wednesday night, the very nights she claimed to be at her classes. Dorian stepped back into the hallway, his face a mask of loyal concern as he caught Woojin's silhouette in the living room. He didn't say a word yet. He didn't have to. He had planted the seeds of a familiar poison. He knew that once Woojin found this evidence, the man who could kill without hesitation would stop seeing the woman he loved and start seeing the bride who had stabbed him in the dark. The trap was set, and the digital noose was tightening around Mabel's neck. Mabel felt the change in the penthouse before she saw it. The air had turned from pressurized to lethal, and the way Woojin's eyes tracked her, cold, clinical, and brimming with a familiar, agonizing suspicion, told her that the floor was about to give way. She had seen him looking at her work bag, his jaw tight as he fought the urge to tear it open. She didn't know what had changed, but she knew the source of the poison. It was Dorian. The way he smirked when Woojin wasn't looking, the calculated accidents that left her alone in rooms with sensitive documents. It was a setup. On Wednesday night, instead of heading to her lecture, she circled back. She used the service entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew she only had a small window while Woojin was at a collection meeting across town. She needed proof, not of her innocence, but of Dorian's guilt. She stood before the heavy mahogany doors of Woojin's private office, the inner sanctum where even the highest-ranking capos feared to tread. Her fingers hovered over the digital keypad. She had watched Woojin enter the code 1,000 times from the hallway while polishing the silver. It wasn't a random string of numbers. It was a date. 0427, April 27th, the date of his mother's passing, the only vulnerability he had ever let slip. The lock clicked with a heavy metallic thud. The room smelled of cedar and old blood. Mabel didn't head for the desk. She went for the auxiliary server Dorian used for off-the-books logistics. Her hands shook as she navigated the encrypted interface, her university training in data analysis kicking in. She didn't look for her own name. She looked for the anomalies in the shipping manifests. There it was, a ghost protocol. Under a hidden directory, she found a series of communications between Dorian and a rival faction in New Jersey. He wasn't just framing her, he was selling the Kang Syndicate's supply routes piece by piece. She saw the fabricated bank transfers he had linked to her name, the digital breadcrumbs designed to lead Woojin straight to her execution. A shadow fell across the desk. Mabel froze, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her wide, terrified eyes. "You were always too smart for your own good, Mabel," a voice drawled from the doorway. Dorian stood there, silhouetted by the hallway light, a suppressed pistol held loosely at his side. He didn't look angry, he looked bored, as if killing her was just another line item on a ledger. It's a shame. Woojin was almost ready to pull the trigger himself, but I suppose a suicide out of guilt works just as well for the narrative. Mabel clutched the flash drive containing the evidence, her mental shield of textbooks and theories failing her as she stared into the barrel of a very real gun. Mabel's thumb hovered over the screen of her phone, her back pressed against the cold metal of the server rack. Dorian was closing in, his footsteps measured and heavy on the mahogany floor. With a trembling hand, she hit send on the draft she had prepared the moment she saw his shadow. 3 words: Dorian, traitor, help. Miles away in a dimly lit warehouse in Queens, Woojin's phone buzzed against his thigh. He had been mid-interrogation, his face a mask of cold indifference, but the moment he read the screen, the air around him seemed to ignite. The clinical suspicion that had been rotting his heart for weeks vanished, replaced by a singular, blinding clarity. He hadn't been losing sleep because he feared her betrayal. He had been losing sleep because he was terrified of a world without her. "To the cars!" Woojin roared, his voice cracking like a whip. "Now!" The drive back to Manhattan was a blur of screeching tires and shattered speed limits. Woojin drove his black sedan like a weapon, weaving through the gridlock of the FDR drive, while his tactical team trailed in 2 armored SUVs. His jaw was set so tight his teeth threatened to crack, his eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of his own penthouse. Every red light was a personal insult, every second a heartbeat he might never get back. He knew Dorian's methods. He knew that by now, the man who had called himself a brother was likely erasing the only thing that made Woojin feel human. Back in the office, a single gunshot shattered the silence, the bullet splintering the mahogany desk inches from Mabel's head. She dove behind the heavy leather chair, the flash drive, clutched in her white-knuckled fist. "You're dead anyway, Mabel," Dorian hissed, stepping over the debris. "Woojin will find the phone. He'll find the money. You're just another unit to him now." Suddenly, the private elevator doors hissed open with a violence that shook the walls. A flashbang grenade detonated in the foyer, white light and deafening thunder swallowing the room. Before the smoke could clear, Woojin burst through the haze, his black button-up flying open, his tattoos vivid under the strobing emergency lights. He didn't look like a boss, he looks like a god of war. Dorian spun, leveling his weapon, but Woojin was faster. 2 rounds caught Dorian in the shoulder and thigh, sending him crashing into the floor-to-ceiling glass. Woojin didn't stop to finish him. He sprinted past the fallen traitor, sliding across the floor to pull Mabel into his arms. He held her with a desperate, crushing force, his face buried in her neck as his tactical team swarmed the room to secure the perimeter. For the first time in 10 years, the man who could kill without hesitation was shaking. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice raw and broken. "I've got you." The chaos of the penthouse began to settle as Woojin's men dragged a bloodied, cursing Dorian out into the night. The sharp smell of gunpowder lingered in the air, but inside the office, the silence was no longer suffocating. Woojin sat on the edge of the mahogany desk, his black shirt torn and his tattoos stark against his pale, adrenaline-flushed skin. He looked down at his hands that had spent a lifetime taking things from others, and saw they were still trembling as he held Mabel's. "I was going to kill you," he whispered, the confession sounding like a jagged piece of glass in his throat. "I let the shadows of a dead woman convince me that your light was a lie." Mabel sat in the leather chair, the adrenaline fading into a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She looked at the man who ruled the city, seeing past the ink and the violence to the terrified boy who had been hiding behind his scars for a decade. "I didn't want your diamonds, Woojin. I didn't want to be another prize in your collection." Woojin reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black velvet box. He hesitated, then set it aside on the desk, moving it away as if it were an insult. "You're right. I tried to buy your loyalty because I didn't know how to earn your trust. I treated you like a maid because I was afraid of what it meant if you were my equal." He stood up, pacing the small space between them. "I've spent my life looking for traitors, but I was the one betraying myself. I love you, Mabel, not as a possession, not as a secret, but as the person who reminded me that I'm still alive." He stopped and looked at her, his gaze dropping to the flash drive she still clutched. "I know about the classes, I know about the debt, and I know you don't want my charity." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, reverent frequency. "So don't think of this as a gift. Think of it as an investment. You are a brilliant strategist, Mabel. You saw Dorian's moves before I did. I want to fund your future, your degree, your foundation, your dreams. Not because I want to own you, but because the world needs what you have to offer more than I need another penthouse." Mabel looked up, her eyes wet but her spirit unbroken. For the first time, she didn't see the mafia boss or the predator. She saw a partner. "An investment?" she asked, a small, tired smile tugging at her lips. "The most important one I'll ever make," he replied, pulling her to her feet and resting his forehead against hers. The man who could kill without hesitation had finally found something worth living for. 6 months later, the penthouse was no longer a tomb of suffocating darkness. Sunlight flooded the space, reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows that once served as Woojin's lonely watchtower. In a private ceremony overlooking the skyline, the man who had built his life on silence and steel finally exchanged vows with the woman who had taught him the value of a voice. Woojin stood at the altar, his blackwork tattoos visible above the collar of a crisp white shirt, but his expression was no longer one of brooding intensity. As Mabel walked toward him, radiant in a gown that flowed like liquid silk, her presence commanding and free, the heavy-lidded fatigue in his eyes was replaced by a clear, unwavering devotion. After the ceremony, they stood together before a small circle of their most trusted allies. Woojin stepped toward a velvet-covered plaque positioned near the center of the room. He took Mabel's hand, his thumb tracing the knuckles that had once scrubbed his floors and clutched textbooks in the dark. "I spent my life believing that power was about what you could take," Woojin said, his voice steady and resonant. "But Mabel showed me that real power is what you can build." He pulled back the cloth to reveal an elegant engraving, the Gloria Brooks Foundation. He announced a $50 million endowment dedicated to inner-city students in Chicago and New York, ensuring that others would have the bridge to education that Mabel had been forced to build with her own blood and tears. Her breath hitched, her eyes filling with a shimmering, grateful warmth. Her mother's legacy was no longer a story of $47 in a hospital bed. It was now a promise of hope for thousands. Woojin hadn't just given her a name or a ring. He had used his empire to heal the worlds that had once tried to break her. He had stepped out of the role of the predator and into the role of a partner. As the orchestra began to play, they shared their first dance as husband and wife. The city lights below began to sparkle like a million tiny stars, but for the first time, Woojin wasn't looking down at a kingdom he controlled. He was looking at the woman in his arms. The girl from Chicago who had nothing, and the Korean mafia boss who thought he had everything, had finally found the one thing they were actually looking for: a love built on trust and a future where neither of them would ever have to sit in the dark alone again. "I love you," she whispered against his lips, the words of final victory over the silence of the past. "I love you more," he replied, finally stepping out of the shadows and into the light of their new life together.